Hi, thank you for attending our seminar, Understanding Teacher Recruitment, Challenges and Solutions, hosted by myself, Henry Tran, Associate Professor in Education Leadership at the University of South Carolina, the Director of the Talent-Centered Education Leadership Initiative, and co-director of the Center for Innovation in Higher Education. I'm hosting alongside Associate Professors Dr. Doug Smith from Iowa State University and Dr. Suzy Hardie from the University of South Carolina. Dr. Smith and I are editor and associate editors of the Journal of Education Human Resources and spent almost a decade researching teacher recruitment and retention issues, particularly in South Carolina. Dr. Hardie leads our leadership preparation program and is also a partner researcher with us on a lot of our work. Today's session is the third time we have convened an open dialogue with the public in a seminar and symposium type format. Our Education Talent Management Seminar in 2017 was the first time we've done this, where we brought people together to engage with our work on teacher recruitment and retention and to begin a communal conversation for dialogue, to make connections from research to practice and illuminate the conditions of teacher recruitment and retention in the Palmetto State. In 2019, we hosted a two-day special focus seminar specifically on understanding rural recruitment and retention for schools, where we invited scholars across the nation, including our keynote speaker, Dr. Richard Ingersoll, a leading authority on teacher labor supply. Recording for this particular seminar can be found on the Talent-Centered Education Leadership webpage. Since then, we synthesized our research and invited experts about various aspects of the status of the teaching profession, particularly in South Carolina, to contribute to the book, How Did We Get Here? The Decay of the Teaching Profession. We then appeared on various forums and outlets to share our findings with a broader audience to really shed light on nuanced understanding of some of the challenges and opportunities associated with the teaching profession. Today's session will include a panel of experts from various aspects of education, including practitioners and scholars, to help illuminate our understanding of teacher recruitment. We'll start with panelist Lisa Ellis, the founder of education advocacy group, South Carolina for Ed. She is a former Democratic nominee for South Carolina Superintendent of Education and is a current active South Carolina teacher. Second is Barnett Berry, a research professor at the University of South Carolina, senior research fellow at the Learning Policy Institute, and author of Advancing Teaching as a Profession, Teacher Working Conditions and the Case of South Carolina from the book, How Did We Get Here? The Decay of the Teaching Profession. Finally, Candace Bethia is the superintendent of Marion County School District. Our three guests will be sharing their expertise on the topic of teacher recruitment. Unfortunately, Patrick Kelly and Tim Monreal were unable to make it to today's session, but we hope that they'll join us for the Understanding Teacher Retention Challenges and Solutions session on May 23rd. I'm going to go ahead and begin. Doug, why don't you start with introducing our entry questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the narrative of teacher shortages has been ongoing, and it dates back over a century. Studies have taken place in South Carolina around teacher working conditions for decades. So Barnett, I'm going to start with you. In your examination and reflection on these past studies, particularly in the state of South Carolina, what have you learned about the status of the profession? And what's changed and what still needs to change?
Thanks, Doug. I've actually been fortunate to be at this so long that I've had a chance to study working conditions in South Carolina, literally in 3 different decades. In the early 90s, my colleague Rick Ginsberg and I did a study of teacher working conditions and burnout, teacher burnout, in the midst of the implementation of the Education Improvement Act of 1984. Then in the mid-2000s, when I was leading my nonprofit, we had a contract to work with Sarah and did a working conditions study in the state built upon similar work that had been done in North Carolina. Then finally, with some wonderful colleagues here at the university, as I just returned, we did a study of teachers' working conditions in the midst of the pandemic in late May, early June 2020. 3 things stick out, ladies and gentlemen. One, teachers are deeply committed to their profession in spite of the enormous barriers and challenges that they're facing, Doug. And I would say that as much as we need to study why teachers are leaving, we need to also study why teachers are staying. So teacher commitments, number 1. Number 2, teacher time. Time is like the 4-letter word of school improvement and clearly school transformation. We still have not even come close to addressing the kind of time that teachers need to be more effective and to work more closely with their colleagues and, more importantly, with their school communities as we move toward hopefully more profound systems of whole child education. And then there's two more things I should say. One, teacher leadership is an enduring issue. It seems like every study shows of how important it is for teachers to lead without leaving the classroom. And our studies definitely showed how much more teachers wanted to lead. We have not done a very good job here or elsewhere documenting actually, and then and how they are innovating. And then finally, I'd like to say, and this is an enduring sad commentary on the status of the profession here in South Carolina and elsewhere, but it's clearly here. If you are a teacher in a high poverty school teaching kids who have the least advantages in life, then your working conditions are much less professional than others. And that is something that has unfortunately endured over 35 years of studying the profession.
Thank you so much, Barnett. Does anybody, Lisa, Candace, you guys have anything to add? So the room, to go back, the question is about how the teacher shortage has been spoken about in a long time now for over centuries. And so do we have any aspects of sort of why we may see anything we've learned about this changes the status of the teaching profession across time and what still needs to change?
From my perspective, as the landscape of supply and demand across the state and across the nation continues to be a problem, one of the things that we have to look at is how we value educators. So often the conversation is so negative about what's going on in the classrooms, what's going on in education, but we have a very noble profession. Teachers work hard. Being a classroom teacher is hard. And we are the group of individuals that shape every other profession that there is. You can't get into law school. You can't get into medical school without going through traditional K-12 education, whether that's in the public or private sector. And so increasing the value of the work of what our teachers and educators are doing, I think is one of the first steps, because somehow we've gotten away from that. Years ago, when you heard of someone being a teacher, you thought very highly of the role. And I think that type of perception still needs to be there because our teachers do a lot. And I think they need to be revered for the tough work that they do every day in the classrooms when children from all backgrounds walk in and we're able to make an impact regardless of their backgrounds and their circumstances.
Thank you, Candace. Lisa, do you have any feedback on that topic?
Well, I think, it goes much deeper into the history of education in South Carolina or in, the United States and the evolution of, industrialized education. When we look back at, moving it into an industrial, and we talk about Horace Mann as the father of education, but he said, hey, let's hire women because we can pay them half as much. And so, this is really steep. The way that we view public education in the United States, and in particular in South Carolina, is steeped in, just historical lack of respect for, really women. And in terms of the profession, you can go all the way back and, you hear, well, teachers are superheroes and it's your calling. And that's not working. I love working with kids and it is my passion, but I need to be respected accordingly. And that shows up in working conditions and salaries. And, one of the things that I've noticed just over my years with SC for Ed and advocacy is that it's a spider web of who to blame. But really in the past 10, 15 years, only the teachers are being blamed for it. And so, we can look at the state General Assembly, we can look at the governor, but we also need to be looking at school districts and how they're treating working conditions. And then, of course, the community, because, right now there's a minor group of people who are very vocal, and yet those people who support public education are sitting on the sidelines quiet. And so we've got to make some really big changes if we want to stop what's going on.
Thank you so much. So and you know that's the South Carolina how do we get here to take a teaching profession book addresses the issue of South Carolina, goes into a lot of the history that you mentioned, Lisa, about sort of the how, you know, how does the teaching profession look since its conception, the transitions of, you know, more women taking roles of educators, and then how did the profession change as a result of that as well. So it's definitely aligned with sort of what we're talking about. Thank you. Now, there are some scholars who question the narrative of a national teacher shortage. They argue that the staffing challenges are actually much more prevalent in certain schools and areas, for example, high poverty, rural and urban schools, which see much more staffing challenges than suburban schools, or maybe for certain positions, for example, special educator, math, science teachers, or people from underrepresented demographic backgrounds, such as male teachers or teachers of color. Therefore, they argue that staffing solutions should not treat shortages as a universal or general phenomenon, but rather a targeted one. Candace, what is your view on differentiated solutions? So, for example, differentiated pay for teachers based on labor market needs. That is, you know, should there be more pay for harder staff positions, demographics, and locales? Or should everyone be paid the same amount? And then how, and if that's the case, how do we adjust for these different needs?
Well, the reality, as I stated earlier, being in two different environments, the components of South Carolina, now being in rural Marion County, with my career being the initial part of my career being in more affluent areas, I will say that there is a tremendous gap in the type of human quality that we're able to attract to small rural communities. And so I do believe that one size fits all is not necessarily what we need across the state. In some districts, up until recently, you had a long list of applicants that you could choose from. So often in rural communities, you are having to look at candidates to see if you have the capacity to build them to where you need them to be. And so coaching becomes a tremendous role. So a lot of your investment is trying to get the staff that you hire to a place where they can be successful in your classrooms. And so I do think some type of incentive. We do it for business community. When businesses want to come into our state, we offer incentives for them to come to rural communities. I think we need to do the same thing for education. And I'll be honest, I didn't always have that view until I worked in a rural community. I had the mindset at one point, you know, education is, you know, pretty much in terms of going into the classrooms and the resources, there shouldn't be that big of a gap, but there is a tremendous gap across this state. Not what anyone has told me, but I have worked in seeing the gaps that exist. And so you do need in small rural communities extra incentives for people to come to those communities. And so looking at it from a different perspective, I just think that we need to take more of an economic-based approach to attracting teachers. Whether it be financial incentives. I think that we need to look at approaches that focus on the housing. In our district, we did purchase, and we have a small teacher apartment as an added factor of attracting a younger population of teachers who may not necessarily have the resources to be able to come and pay for rent or to pay for housing. Also focusing on other quality of life factors for families. Childcare. We're now offering 3-year-old programs for our staff members. And so that's a savings for them. So just thinking out of the box. And a lot of our younger population also want growth opportunities, making sure that we are providing growth opportunities for them as well. And so ultimately, you have to think out of the box. You have to do things different. I don't think there is a one bullet solution, but I think that we're constantly strategizing, constantly trying to navigate what can we do to combat this labor market issue. We know as a buyer's market right now, some of the districts that never had to recruit, districts that never had to show up to a recruitment fair, everyone is at the table now. Everyone is in need. And so we have to think differently. And we have to do differently. And I think more of, I hate that I'm saying this, but more of a business approach when we're trying to attract teachers.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Candace. One of the things I noticed when I was interviewing and kind of researching in these rural spaces is that I was told by many districts and HR professionals that there wasn't even housing available, even if the teachers could afford it. in some of these rural communities. And so that's definitely one of the challenges. I would think that kind of surprised me. Like that's not something you immediately think about. And yeah, so same question, Lisa and Barnett. We'll start with Lisa and then we'll come to Barnett. Should there be differentiated solutions based on differentiated staffing needs, like for variations in positions, locale, demographics? What do y'all think?
Lisa?
So I think, Candace is exactly right. I teach at Blythewood High School and Richland too. And, but I think it's humorous when we talk about lack of teachers now, because I actually came into the profession under critical needs, which was an alternative program because there weren't enough, you came in under critical locations where you worked or critical subject areas. And so, if we're talking about lack of teachers, we've got to be recognizing that if I've been doing this for 22 years, and this is not something that is new. And I think that it's also key to look at the fact of what has our state done to stop that, and really our government hasn't done anything. If we talk about funding, Candace is exactly right. We've got to look at not only salary, but other ways to attract and retain teachers in rural communities. That could be housing, if somebody, but districts and the state have to be flexible in that, because I may prefer, if I have housing, I may prefer to use it, an incentive to take college classes to get an, advanced degree to increase my salary that way. I'm sort of hesitant about paying teachers depending on, whether they're special ed or math or anything like that, because I think that's a very slippery slope in terms of, honestly, what I think schools and districts are dealing with now is we've got, and as much as I've fought for teachers over the last 4 years, we've got weak teachers in our classrooms because there's no one to replace them. And so to me, if I'm an English teacher and English teachers aren't as difficult to find, and I'm busting my tail every day to meet the needs of my students, but next door to me is a math teacher who does the bare minimum, but because he's, and I shouldn't say he, because they are, certified in math, they're getting paid more money, I'm going to become really resentful, right? And that's going to either encourage me to do less, and because that is, and so I think that really needs to be researched, because I know teachers are already frustrated in buildings where they feel that they are doing the best that they can, and yet they're next door or down the hall for somebody who's just, in essence, phoning it in. So I'm not sure that I believe in paying teachers based on just their certification. I think that they're a way, and I'm also not a fan of merit pay because I think it can be very subjective depending on who your leadership is. But I do think we've got to start recognizing our rock star teachers and doing whatever we can to keep them in there, and also working to build the pipeline back up so we can get rid of the weak teachers that are causing trouble everywhere.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Barnett, what might you have to add to that conversation?
Well, I'm going to say ditto, but I'm going to say it this way. Yes, but we do need to differentiate. But the last thing we need to do, and both Candace and Lisa alluded to this, is just implement some particular program or initiative in isolation of the coherent system of teacher development that needs to be created and sustained, and it needs to be led by the state. That's the only way we're going to address the deep inequities in the system. A quick historical anecdote, because I think I'm here because of my advanced age as well as the decades of doing studies in this field. Back in the mid 2000s, when we were documenting some of those working conditions, it just so happened that the state of South Carolina, I don't know if you know this, Lisa or Candace, instituted a program to recognize and reward accomplished teachers and pay them literally 50% more. So if they were making $40,000 a year, which was, they probably weren't back then, but they were, they would be making $60,000 if they go to a high poverty community, high need community in South Carolina. The state allotted 500 positions. Y'all with me? We got only 1 in 5 takers, and the program disappeared within a few years. We have the school or teaching policy reform landscape in the United States and in South Carolina is kind of littered with these types of initiatives. Let me just close saying one thing, Henry and Doug and everyone else. I've been fortunate to work in other countries, some of the top performing jurisdictions around the world. And when you ask the ministers of education how they created their systems of teacher development, their uniform answers are, we learned it all from American educator practitioners like Lisa and Candace and researchers like Henry and Doug. We just don't know how to put the system in place. We don't have the political will to do so. But I'm still hopeful we can do so as we kind of see the Gen Z community coming up and how we might build upon their entrepreneurial spirit, because they are to be the future of our teaching profession.
Thanks so much, Barnett. So some critics argue that the media coverage and stories on the teacher shortage crisis and the difficult working conditions and low pay of teaching actually makes the teaching profession unattractive and discourages people from pursuing the field. And so I guess the implication is maybe people shouldn't be so vocal about that. Lisa, what is your response to that? Suzy, unmute Lisa.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. I feel that we can blame the media for a lot of things, particularly in the last 7 or 8 years, in terms of how that shift has happened. Moving away from news to perspective based and all of that, and bias and all of that. But I think it is that. But I think it's more teachers are just, we've been beaten down for so many years, that it's hard to encourage others to go through the profession or go into the profession. And I think about, again, in my 22-year experience, when I first started teaching, I had parents, and I could call the parents and they were going to take care of the discipline situation. And that, has changed. And Candace is right. People really did the community really respected teachers, even if the General Assembly didn't, in terms of pay and all of that. But that has changed. I think the increase in, social media and opinion-based fact sort of thing, and my experience is the correct one without researching. I think all of that leads to, just a very frustrating experience. And I think part of it, I follow on social media, like board teachers and teachers of Instagram and those sort of things. And I love it because it's the truth bombs, right? I'm like, yep, because that is exactly what happened today. I was driving home today and I was like, oh, why am I so hungry? And I realized it's because I heated up my food in the microwave and never pulled it out to eat because I didn't get to stop. And so I think part of it is we as teachers have not done a good job of expressing exactly what our day looks like, or what we do every day. I think the other issue is that everybody thinks they understand teaching because they were once a student in school, right? And so part of the other problem is that, particularly when you're looking at our General Assembly and the average age of our South Carolina Senate, is, their experience with school is very different than the way school exists today. And that is part of the problem. Or like a parent, pictures what a classroom looked like when they went through it. And so we have got to, as teachers, do a better job of explaining to the community, what it's like teaching 30 kids in a class or 25 first graders, which is insanity to me. I can't even believe we still have elementary school teachers because of class sizes. Um, but on the other hand, we're too tired to do it, right? Because we spend all of our energy doing what is best for our students during the day without resources, without spending our own money without time. I hear from teachers all the time in elementary schools about how they're not able to use the restroom because they've lost their, planning period. And so we have to do a better job of expressing what the day to day is like. And then people have to be receptive to that and say, oh my gosh, that's so different from when I was in school. We've got to change that, and be willing to stand up and fight for it. But at the end of the day, if people in South Carolina don't vote differently, this is just going to get worse. This is just going to get worse. And so, I think that we have to really understand what teaching is like today. You used to say, if you didn't teach when cell phones were a thing, you don't know what it's like. Now it's like, if you didn't teach through COVID, you have no idea what teaching is like in a K through 12 classroom. That was the hardest time of my life. And we have not recovered. We have not been given the time to mentally recover from it, physically recover from it. And so you have, teachers that made it through COVID and, are coming out of it, and they're just done now because nobody gave them a break, and it's gotten worse since then because of things what were supposed to be short-term parameters in place to help students have now been moved into long-term things. And I feel like that was a really long-winded answer, but we've got to do better, listening to teachers and actually making changes that they suggest.
Thank you, Lisa. Barnett, Candace, do you have anything to add to that? And don't feel compelled to. If you feel like Lisa fully
Well,
agrees with it, that's fine. But if you have something to say, add, please.
yes, I think I would be remiss not to say that there are great things happening across our state in schools. And I have to acknowledge that because we hear so much of the negativity that sometimes we don't celebrate the things that are going well. And so one of the things that I think that we have to do as educators, we know that we can't ignore the concerns. We can't ignore the things that need those challenges that we have. But also, we can't ignore that there are great things happening. There are students that are graduating that are being successful. And so, how do we get those stories out? And then, how do we bring more people to the table to help us address those challenges, bringing in a variety of different stakeholders? So often, we try to handle the concerns within our schools, but we need to tap into external resources, bring community members, bring your local officials, bring your parents, bring graduates, alumni to the table, because what is going on in public education just cannot be fixed with educators. We need the help of everyone because what is going on was not just created by educators. So many things that we are dealing with in our schools comes into our schools from the outside, from the community, from homes. And so we need to use those resources to help us come up with a solution to make things better for our outcomes for our children.
Thank you, Candace. Barnett, do you have anything to add?
Just ditto to both Lisa and Candace here. We do need a more unified voice that's built upon evidence and filled with story. And I'm going to emphasize the word unified. We in South Carolina, not unlike other states, but in my estimation, we are more fractionated, more siloed. We have multiple teacher and educator associations that are not on the same page. It's very difficult for the public to hear the story of success, Candace, the many stories of success that are out there in a powerful way. I'll just want to quickly say that we ought to go back and look at how the nursing profession, also a female dominated occupation, that has emerged in the last 20 years, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but nurses took control over their profession in the ways that teachers have not yet done so yet in America. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there, and we can build upon them.
Eloquently put. Thank you, Barnett. So Candace, I'm going to go back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. So I think it's important for the public kind of to understand a distinction between recruitment into the profession and recruitment into districts, and then the equity concerns associated with that. Some districts don't have access to those nearby amenities that we talked about, housing, but even things like professional development or opportunity or even amenities. I'm thinking things like malls, restaurants, groceries. I mean, some of those are much more of a distance for individuals depending on where you live. And other people don't have those issues. So even if the pay between a district that's in the city that's close to various amenities is the same as one that's in the remote rural location, you may still have a potential disadvantage if you're in a particular type of community because of the advantage and disadvantage associated with that. So I was thinking, in terms of your district, what type of challenges are you seeing and hearing from your fellow superintendents, maybe in your local area as well, sort of just highlighting those regional differences and challenges? I know you did that a little bit, but maybe kind of just spotlight.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Not only do we have a challenge of recruitment, of course, that is a concern. We were one of the districts where we were under the 40,000 teacher average salaries. And so last year, finally, teachers in Marion County with no years experience got up to 40. They need to be much higher. But we were grateful for that. And we know that right now there's consideration for an additional teacher increase. But as you just stated, when you sit in between more affluent, economically, I guess, well-suited communities, when you're in an economically stressed community, it is so hard, even if you have the same salary schedules, looking at the quality of life factors. Marion County, we sit right against a coastal part of our state. I won't call another district's name, but we sit right by a coastal part of our state. And it's just hard to attract, especially young teachers, to our community because we don't have the glitz and the glam of what other communities have. And so what we've tried to really focus on is creating an environment where if they leave, it's a tough decision to leave because we want to make you feel valued. The climate of your school, the culture of your school. When can we do smaller classroom teacher ratios? I'm telling you, I'll never forget being in a classroom. It makes a difference having a smaller classroom to teacher ratio. And then also the other challenge that we have when we do get good human capital, when we do get our classroom staff, we invest, we do the coaching, we do the PDE, we do everything to get them to the level that they need to be. But then as you're getting ready to exit the profession, we all know retirement plays a major role. Your 3 highest years are of importance. And so we have individuals that we've invested so much in, but they make those livelihood decisions the last 3 years of their career. They go to a neighboring district that has a higher salary because they're looking out for their livelihood for retirement. And that's tough because you understand people making those decisions. And so that's why I go back to we do need an extra carrot, something in addition to just the base for rural communities. And I do think that you have to have some parameters, how you qualify, but it is desperately a need. It's hard to recruit and then it's hard to retain. And so we're just seeing it on both ends of the spectrum.
Thanks so much, Candace. Lisa Barnett, do you have anything to add about differences between recruitment into the profession and maybe recruitment into districts that may have unique challenges, and sort of educating everyone about sort of what those challenges might be that if they're not familiar with the context, they may not know about?
Labor markets have teacher labor markets have been historically local and to some extent regional. Dan Lordy, the sociologist, the eminent sociologist, putting this out 50 some odd years ago, and it's still true today. We need a state strategy, but embedded in it, nested in it, a regional strategy. We need to start helping school districts not compete with each other for teachers, but to collaborate with each other, with teachers. We can do that. And if we ever get broadband sufficiently in place, there's a lot of things that we could do virtually, everyone, that could really help us think very differently about the profession. Last word here, I spoke to the governor's, the legislative task force the other day, And Patrick Kelly is a member of it, as Henry noted. And I told the group that we are expecting teachers to get 2023 Series 7 BMW results, and we're putting them, and I hate to put it this way, we are putting them in a 1972 Pinto. We've got to change the system and the vehicle in which teachers are driving.
Thanks a bunch, Barnett. Lisa, do you have anything to add about sort of differences between recruitment into the profession versus individual districts and the challenges, the unique challenges associated with that?
Okay, thank you. It goes back to the funding formula. And the fact that what Candace is talking about, the fact that the South Carolina minimum salary schedule only goes to year 23, and teachers that are previous to 2012 can retire, can't retire until year 28 to receive all of their benefits. And so, and when you ask the question to the General Assembly, well, where did year 23 come from? And their response is, oh, well, that's when policemen can retire. I don't, and I think, the policies that are in place make no sense, which is frustrating. But, again, for the last 4 years, we have said you have got to increase the state minimum schedule to at least step 28, because Candace is exactly right. We compared Jasper County and Beaufort County's things. And so what teachers were doing was getting to year 23 in Jasper County and then getting hired in Beaufort, because they increased their salaries $10,000 and only had to drive 20 minutes to do it, right? And so, those are things that we have got to demand more from the state in terms of equity, and really not depend on local funding so much. That was the problem with last year's $4,000 salary increase, is that 30% of it was expected to be made up by the local districts. And so only about 11 school districts, those teachers actually saw the entire $4,000. And so we've got to hold the state budget more accountable to send money where money is needed. One of my dad's colleagues said, you tax where the wealth is and you educate where the child is. And we've got to redo that whole distribution of how we fund our schools if we want our children in Marion to have the same opportunities as our children in Greenville or Horry or Charleston.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Doug will ask the final question that we have before we open it up for the public to ask Q&A. Doug?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're in the audience, and this will be our final question. So as you have questions that you would like to ask of the panel, please start typing them into the chat, and our moderator, Dr. Hardie, is going to help us facilitate that here on the back end. But it's been well documented that teacher education program enrollments have been declining. They've been declining South Carolina. They've been declining where I'm at in Iowa, and everywhere in between. So the real question that we have is, how do we get more people interested into the teaching profession? And how do we make the teaching profession more attractive right now to people that can be highly effective teachers but aren't currently considering teaching as a profession? So I'd like to start with you, Lisa.
Okay, I'm already unmuted. Great. I think you've got to pay them, right? Again, when we look historically at the fact that it was a female-dominated profession, that was because women didn't have the same opportunities historically that men did. And so, I use the example of my mother, who, when she was going through school, she had 3 job opportunities. One was a secretary, one was a nurse, and one was a teacher. She couldn't type, so secretary was out. She couldn't stand the sight of blood, so that left, teaching. And she enjoyed teaching and it worked for her. But, if you were in that period and you enjoyed chemistry as a female, most of your job options were to teach chemistry in high school. Now, women are being hired as chemists in labs across the state. And so when you're looking at your salary and options, and you're, a chemistry major, and you can go and work for Nephron in Columbia and start out at $75,000-$80,000, or you can teach chemistry to a bunch of high school students and start out at 40. Like, it's a no-brainer. So, if we've got to really think of the teaching profession as competitive against all other professions, because the labor market, as we talked about, has changed so much, and who has access to what type of employment and jobs, and particularly with these new these new generations coming through, they are going to change jobs tons and tons of times. We've already seen that. For me to stay in one profession for 22 years is really unheard of. I have a friend who's, late 20s, and she's had 5 jobs in the 4 years that I've known her. And so we've really got to look at it being competitive against all other industry, because that's the only way that you are going to be able to recruit new teachers in, because we want to have a good life. We want to be able to live where we want to, and we want to be able to spend our money how we want to, and not have to work multiple jobs and all of that added stress. Teaching is hard. I mean, it is a difficult profession. Any day, you never know what you're getting into, and that's a very different scenario than somebody who's going to walk into a coding, but sit at a computer all day and do that, or walk into a chemistry lab and do experiments. And so we've got to recognize what we as teachers bring to, and Candace mentioned this earlier, what we bring to the world, but we've got to start elevating that salary and improving those working conditions, because until you do that, people are going to choose other professions right and left.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Candace, Barnett, do you guys-
Yes, I just completely agree with what Lisa stated. The competitive pay, looking at it from a business perspective and the labor market, right now, as I stated earlier, it is a buyer's market in almost any profession. And so to get to people to want to come, people make livelihood decisions, and they want to make sure that they have jobs where they can take care of their families, they can have, the quality of life that they desire. And right now, for some educators, that's just not the case. Another thing that we're doing on the other end of the spectrum in our district is trying to tap into student interest early. When I went through high school, it was the teacher cadet program. You got in high school, and if you want to go into education, you went through teacher cadet. We just recently had to start a pro team class at our middle schools, trying to get students interested very early in teaching. I think is another thing that we have to do. I don't think that you can just sell it when it's time for you to graduate from high school and go into college. You have to sell it to children early. And so just as we have career fairs for all these other careers, highlight and have fairs for fields in education, teacher fair, invite students to teacher fairs, invite students to recruitment fairs, just to spark that interest. So just thinking out of the box, but most importantly, the competitive pay. And I have to say the environment, making sure that teachers are in work environments that where they feel valued, where they have the resources that they need, and where they have the support that they need to be successful.
Thanks so much, Candace. Barnett, do you have anything to add about how to make the profession more attractive?
I was going to say, thank you, Candace and Lisa. I could not agree more, but I'm going to say the job is not just hard, it is impossible. And we're not going to recruit Gen Zers who are highly collaborative, more entrepreneurial than us boomers to the profession in the one teacher, one classroom model that has existed since time began, it seems like. Nursing in many ways became a much more highly valued profession because of how they went to more of a team model, and also how they differentiate amongst the ranks and distributed expertise. I must say that we already have evidence of this happening around the country in pockets, but I think we need a strategy in the state to really change the nature of the job so that the someone who wants to teach 25% of the time or 50% of the time can do so under the tutelage and under the support of some of our best accomplished teachers who are paid as much as, Lisa, as our principals. We should have the highest paid anybody in a school system ought to be someone who teaches kids regularly, period. And we can do that if we start thinking very differently about how we allocate people. We have 45,000 teachers in South Carolina, about 90,000 people with credentials who are in the system. And we have all these retirees too, who could, who are pretty darn young still, and who could still teach part of the time if we use them strategically. And this is where we need to go. Let's get out, more than get out of the box. Let's get out of the cargo container. We've got to really think differently about the profession if we're going to serve children well and serve them all equitably well.
Restructuring the work environment and what it means to be
Totally.
Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Yes, sir.
Suzy, do we have any questions, and Doug, from the general audience? If not, I have a question I really want to ask.
I always got questions too, Henry.
No? All right, I do have a question. I was wondering, so in our book, we spotlighted the historic May 1st, 2019 statewide teacher walkout in South Carolina and the context leading up to it. Lisa, I'll begin with you. What all, if anything, has changed as a result of the walkout for teacher working conditions?
Well, since May 1st, 2019, you know, we at C4Ed, we got a lot of negative feedback about how dare you ask teachers to take one day off to fight for their profession. And you know, I used the statistics since then. According to Sarah, 21,121 teachers have left the profession permanently. And so, you know, I think that statistic is really glaring when you think in 2019, teachers were talking about, you know, pay, working conditions, and nothing happened. And a part of the problem is, again, on teachers and supporters of education, and that they're not voting with education as a priority in South Carolina. So that's one of the problems, because I think that in 2019, we had the General Assembly running scared, and then, you know, the 2020 elections came, and the same old happened. And so, but I think that we are now seeing pockets of people who are, you know, still committed and willing to step out. We're seeing movement on teacher contracts, because that's part of the problem, is the way that the contracts language is written here in South Carolina. And so we're seeing, you know, pockets of teachers that are fighting back with that. There's great legislation that is stuck in subcommittee that could really change working conditions overnight if they address the teacher contracts. And so, you know, but I think the bigger issue is that the people who are really fighting the hardest for public education and ultimately for students have left the profession now. I mean, they're part of those 21,000. And that's something that we need to speak to you know, we talk about this teacher recruitment and retention task force that I guess I should be grateful for, but we've been saying the same thing for 4 years. So you didn't need to spend $50,000 on a task force when all you needed to do was listen to teachers, because our tune has not changed. But, you know, really, we've got to change how we vote, and we've got to make sure teachers are voting, make sure that people are voting, and they're voting at all levels, because it's the working conditions are getting worse, but that's because we're not voting at the school board level in the way that we should to protect teachers. We're seeing the effects of, you know, the 2022 elections right now in negative ways at the school board level. So I wish I had better news, but since 2019, it's gotten worse, and, you know, that's COVID and, you know, all of that, but it just, the kids coming back from COVID, all of that is harder than it ever has been.
I spoke with some teachers, and a lot of them shared with me that they were interested in engaging in the teacher activism and the teacher walkout, but they were threatened by their district with their jobs if they were to do so. They were told, like, if you do that, you're not going to come back to a job. And there was almost like a culture of fear that came as a result of that. So many people wanted to participate, but they they kind of did it in silence, or they did it kind of online or different ways without kind of revealing themselves because of that fear. I see a question from the audience, and it's related to this topic, is a lot of the backlash that we saw from that was that they were constantly, and I write about this in my research a lot, they were constantly pitting teachers against students. So the idea is that if you participate in activism and you're fighting for better working conditions, you're somehow self-interest and not putting the students' interests ahead. How do you, so there's a question from the audience, like, is there a strategy to address that? How, like, or is it always, how do we change that narrative that what we're doing? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll speak just to what you said really quickly about we heard that from all over the state. School administrators, district office administrators, superintendents were saying that. And part of our frustration is we should all be on the same page. I keep saying as a teacher, I'm always going to have a job because online schools need teachers, private schools need teachers, parochial schools need teachers, kids need tutors. But when you start moving money, who doesn't need a job or isn't needed? A school administrator or a school board member, because you no longer have. So we've got to start realizing that we all need to be fighting for our teachers, because when there's no teachers, that school administrator is going back into the classroom because they have a teacher certification. But to speak to, that was one of my when I was on the campaign trail, everywhere I said, I made sure to point out that a teacher's working conditions are a student's learning conditions. And so if you want your student to be in an environment that is safe, that is welcoming, that is warm and inviting, where they are encouraged to learn, then you've got to take care of that teacher. But I think that people who are not supportive of public education do the pitting against each other. I mean, we're seeing that. And when we talk about earlier, when we talked about, how to pay, and you're potentially pitting math teachers against English teachers and all of that. So I think that, Barnett is right, where we've got to really think outside the box, but we've got to make sure that we are protecting each other and taking care of each other and validating each other in that sense, and making sure people understand that the students are in these conditions every day. And when you take care of your teachers, a happy teacher, you have happy students.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I'm looking at a time now. It's 4:30. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so we're just going to go ahead and wrap up here today. We started off a little rocky, but that's not atypical in education. So we roll with the punches, and here we are. I think it went smoothly. The second 75% of it. I do want to kind of mention one more thing, that we will reconvening on May 23rd at 3:30 Eastern time via Zoom for our conversation about retention. But before we leave, I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to say what they might want to share, but maybe we didn't get to, a sign-off comment before we kind of end the meeting. Why don't we start with Barnett? We'll go to Candace, and then we'll end with Lisa. Thank you. Barnett? Unmute.
There. We've got to change the nature of the teaching job. Think of organizing teachers the way we organize a wide array of medical professionals in an operating room. And think about how we can make the job of teaching more joyful, so the job of learning for kids is more joyful as well.
Thanks so much. Candace?
As in our state, we focus so heavily on accountability across the state and student achievement and student outcomes. Just want to make sure that we realize that the most single factor to have the greatest impact on student achievement and student outcomes is having a quality teacher in the classroom. And therefore, we have to continue to engage in these conversations. How do we teach our good teachers in classrooms? Making sure that our teachers have voice, making sure that we're listening to that voice, and making sure that we're making changes to change the conditions and the landscape of our classroom.
Thank you, Candace. And I like to, when we talk about accountability, I like to talk about, what about accountability for work environments? That's a big thing that's happening in HR now. It's relevant to our conversation. And Lisa, why don't you send us off with final comments?
I continue to be grateful for all of these conversations and dialogue. But, it's not enough just to sit here and listen. We need to go out and act in whatever way that we feel comfortable doing, or a little bit uncomfortable, because You know, we can sit on a Zoom all day and talk about the problems, but we need to get out there and start making sure that the people who can solve the problems, we're holding them accountable. Because again, South Carolina is one of the best, I think one of the best states to live in, but we need to really take care of our children because they're our future.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you, Doug and Suzy, for helping facilitate this. Hopefully we'll see you all again in May to talk about teacher retention. Thank you and have a good afternoon.